Hi, this is meteorologist Steve Pelletieri, and I am the weatherman. Thanks for listening to our first podcast, and we're going to be talking about the 2019-2020 winter season here in the Northeast. First, a little bit of background about me. I'm from Hillside, New Jersey, northern New Jersey, Union County. What I do right now is basically I am a meteorologist. I have my own private weather consulting firm called Ion Weather Research, LLC. It's a family business. I have my two sons and my wife involved. We've got students from the Morris County VOTEC who are helping out, and just about anybody else that we can sort of corral to make sure that we get done or what needs to be done. I am a certified consultant meteorologist, and that means I am board certified by the American Meteorological Society. As a certified consulting meteorologist and also a broadcast meteorologist. I've been doing radio since about 1975. Local stations, not major stations, not big TV, just local stations in New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania. And again, like I mentioned, I have two boys, both of which are helping us out. And I, most importantly, am very interested in aviation. In my early days of Ion Weather, which used to be called the American Atmospheric and Meteorological Association, ATMOS or something like that. That was what we were working under in the 1970s and 1980s until we changed over to Ion Weather. We had a lot of aviation clients. We used to do aviation weather briefings. Now you can get most of that on the internet, so that is not needed. But what I'd like to talk about today is the past 2019-2020 winter season. I got to tell you something. It's been kind of wacky. It's the month of May. Today is May 11th, 2020. Today is May 11th, 2020, and we just had hail. This past weekend, we had snow during the overnight Friday, Saturday. That was the 8th, 9th of May. And we had snow at around 2 a.m. The snow was reported in New York City. Probably happened just about everywhere across central and northern New Jersey and New York and New England. We also had snow showers and snow squalls on Saturday, the 9th of May. Now, that hasn't happened very often. We're going to use New York City records. New York City has weather records that goes all the way back into the 1800s. First records from New York City, 1868, 1869. And what I'm doing is I'm basically looking at the monthly and annual snowfall for Central Park, New York City. They have been taking observations there forever. The National Weather Service used to be at Rockefeller Center. They have since moved out to Upton, New York, which is out in Suffolk County at the Brookhaven Labs. It's a federal facility. Good idea. They're out there. It's a quiet area, but they do handle the weather situation for New York City, Nassau, Suffolk County, Rockland, Westchester, and also Orange County and sections of Putnam County, along with northeastern New Jersey, Bergen, Union, Essex, and also Passaic County area. We're Clifton all the way up to the higher elevations of New Milford. So they handle that. The rest of New Jersey is handled by the National Weather Service at Mount Holly, which is called the Philadelphia National Weather Service. But that's another story for another day. In the meantime, just want to tell you that the New York City data is very, very good. It goes all the way back to the winter of 1868 and 1869. So we're taking a look at all that weather data. And again, I just told you that we had measurable snowfall in the month of May. Today, we're having a tough time figuring out whether or not it was sleet or if it was hail that occurred as a strong cold front is going through. And we have another frost warning for the evening hours of the 11th, 12th, and we'll have it for the 12th, 13th. By the end of this week, temperatures will be in the 80s. And of course, this is during the whole COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with, where everybody's keeping distance, wearing masks, staying in. We don't have any baseball. We just heard that baseball starting off on July 4th. That's going to be good, but we've got all that time to work up to it. Hopefully it will not snow in the month of June, but if it does, we're going to talk about that quite a bit as well. But just going back to the weather records for Central Park. And again, as I mentioned, we had snow during the month of May reported in Central Park this past Saturday, along with a lot of places in North Jersey. And there are only two other times that actually happened. And it didn't happen in the 1800s. And it didn't happen in the early 20th century either. It actually happened the winter of 1945-1946. There was a trace of snow on 1945-1946, and that was a winter that was a fairly average type of winter that we had. 31.4 inches in New York City. Now, when I mentioned that how much snowfall that we have in New York City, you have to imagine if you're in New Jersey, it's going to be more. If you're out on the island, it's going to be a little bit less. If you're along the Jersey Shore or all the way down into Maryland or Delmarva, of course, a lot less there. But this is basically centered for the Philadelphia, New York, Boston area, New York City in the center. So we'll talk about that. And again, that one time that we had it, snowfall in May was in the winter, I suppose the winter of 1945-46, where we had that trace in the month of May. Of course, that was at the end of the World War II VE Day and also VJ Day that occurred in August of 1945. 45-46, it was the following winter after the end of the Second World War. The second time that we had some snowfall that occurred in the month of May in New York City, and again, I'll mention I'm using New York City because it's a warmer area, and if it snows in New York, it's probably snowed pretty much anywhere else, and that was a trace that occurred in the winters of 1976-1977, and that was quite telling. Now, that year we had about 24.5 inches of snow in New York City, which is pretty close to the normal. Really not a tremendous amount, but the interesting thing is the following year we had some pretty wild weather in the winter of 1977-78, where we had pretty much the high for that decade, 50.7 inches of snow in New York City. And that, of course, because of some tremendous storms that occurred on January, February, and a few storms, lighter storms in the month of March. But 20-inch storms or 20-inch totals for the whole month of January in 1977, and about 23 inches in February of 1978. Excuse me, that 20-inch figure, 20.3 inches of snow in January 1978, 23 inches in February of 1978. So the 77-78 season, after we had that snow in May, was a maximum for that decade. The low for the decade, the 1970s in New York City, 2.8 inches of snow. Now, I mention that because it's pretty appropriate to what's happening right now. The winter of 2019-2020 in New York City, a very, very low amount, 4.8 inches of snowfall. Here in New Jersey, Northwest Jersey, you had a little bit more. Of course, as I mentioned, you're going to have more as you go into the higher elevations. You go away from the city, you're going to have less along the shore, so on and so forth. I'm not even sure the Jersey Shore really even got any super measurable snowfall, but it was really a very dry year. And we're going to talk about what the predictions were, too. But interestingly enough, we had a situation this year, this season, 2019-2020, where we had low amounts of snow, and it was the second lowest as compared to what happened in 1972 and 1973. So we can go all the way back into the late 1800s. We had 8.1 inches of snow in 1877, 1878. Look at that. There's like 100-year or 10-year differences in the amount of snowfall or the amount of maximum and minimums. And I've actually pointed out the highs and the lows for each decade in the 1870s to the 1880s in New York City. 60.3, 8.1. That's the high and the low for a whole season. Hard to believe that you can have something like that. I mean, one year it's 60 inches. Then another year, maybe a few years down the line, only 8 inches. If you go into 1880, 1890, it wasn't as much of a difference. 44 for a high, 16 inches for a low. In the 1890s to 1900, that's the interesting year. 2 years in a row, a high and a low. 1898, 1899, 55, almost 56 inches of snow in New York City. 1898, 1899. In the century year, 1899 in 1900, 13.4, and then the year after that, 1900, 1901, 9.1. So there's 2 seasons in a row where we had some low amounts coming off a very high amount that we had in 1898. So that's pretty significant. In that first 10 years of the 20th century, 53.2 inches of snow in the 1906-1907 period. And we had similar situations like that as you go through the 11s to the 20s, 20s to the 30s. During the war years, 40 to 45, the high was 63.8 inches. That occurred in 47, 48, mainly because of a big storm that occurred in December of 1947. In that one, 30 inches of snow right there. You take that out of the picture and you have basically an average amount. But you can also look, in the 1950s, not a lot of snowfall in the 1950s. Hey, maybe it had something to do with all those nuclear testing that they were doing back then. The low for the whole of 1950 to 1958, 59 was 11.5, and the high was in 1959, 1960 at 39.2. So you can see not really a lot of snowfall in the 1950s. 1960s, a high of 54.7. This, of course, is what I remember when I was a boy. Of course, the snow seemed like it was up to my waist, but then again, I was only 2.5, 3 feet tall. So you have one big storm, an 18-inch snowstorm. Of course, it's highly significant. 2 years later, in the winter of 62, 63 in New York City, 16 inches of snow. And the all-time low, I should mention, I said 4.8 earlier. The all-time low for New York City was actually in the 1970s. 1972, 1973, 2.8 inches of snow in New York City. You get to 1978, 79, which we just talked about, 77, 78, which we talked about earlier, 50.7. The next year was fairly high, about 30 inches, which is pretty close to normal. And similar situations happened as we go into the 80s, although not as much great. You see a lot of snowfall in the 1990s, 75 inches of snow in the winter of 95, 96 in New York City, and 53 inches in 93, 94, then a low amount. Then we had our lowest, 5.5, was 97, 98. So you can see, even though it didn't snow this year, it didn't snow a lot in New York City or even in the Northeast, basically, it could change. It can change in a dime. And of course, we've had very warm conditions, November, December, January, February, and even March. And then all of a sudden, April, colder than normal by 4 degrees. Had snow during the month of April about 3 or 4 times. And here in the month of May, we've had measurable snowfall. Cold conditions. We have a frost advisory for tonight and a frost advisory for Tuesday night, Wednesday as well. Then warm weather as we head into the middle of the week. So with weather, just about anything can happen. So just trying to say that there's a trend, you don't really see it. You just see a trend within 11 or 10-year cycles, which is pretty much a solar cycle, somewhere around 11 years from what we call solar maximum to solar minimum. So quite a bit of information there as far as that's concerned. So if we go to the 2010s to the 2020s, basically where we are right now, we start the new decade in 21. 61.9 inches of snow in 2010-2011 winter in New York City. The low, 4.8 in 2019, 2020, but it just keeps going on. Traces in March, traces in April, traces in May. So what's to come? What are we going to see again? Well, the interesting thing that you can talk about is when you have a minimum as far as snowfall, especially when you have less than, say, 10 inches of snowfall, does the next year do the same thing? No, it doesn't. When we take a look all the way back to and we're looking back to of course, to the 1800s, we go all the way back to 1877, 78, when we had 8.1 inches. The next year, 35.7. Go to another one when we had less than 10 inches of snow. 1900 to 1901, 9.1 inches of snow. The next year, 30 inches of snow. So that didn't hold true. Let's say, for example, 3.8 inches of snow in 1918, 1919. The next year, 47.6, which incidentally wasn't a maximum for that period of time. But the next year, complete opposite. Let's go to another time. 5.3 inches of snow, 1931, 1932. The next year, 27 inches. The year after that, 52 inches of snow. So you can see 2 years in a row, it really got cranked up there when we had less than 10 inches. I have not seen in these New York figures 2 years in a row of sub 10 inches of snow. The only thing we do see is in the 1980s, and I'll get to that in a moment, but if you take a look back to 1972, 1973, remember the 1970s, and a lot of crazy things happened, 2.8 inches of snow in 72, 73. The next year, about 10 times as much, 23.5 inches of snow, which is pretty close to the normal for New York City. Continuing to stay pretty much average for the next several years until reaching a maximum of that 77, 78 storm that I told you about, or the season that I told you about. It's when you go to 1988, 1989. We had 8.1 inches of snow in the 88, 89. The next year was only 13.4. So it was more, but it wasn't significantly more. Similar situation in what we call 97, 98. We had 5.5 inches of snow. The next year, 12.7. Hey, it's double. So you can say the next year is going to be double. But is it going to be single? Doesn't look like it. Into the 2000s, 2001, 2002, 3.5 inches of snow, New York City in the 2001, 2002 winter season. The next year, 49 inches. 49 inches. 1 year difference. 1 year, practically nothing. The next year, bangs right up there. In 11, 12, 7.4. Next year, 26.1, 7, 14, 21. Maybe 2.5, close to 3 inches. 2.5 to 3 times as much snowfall during that period of time. And in 1920, of course, we had the 4.8. So what do we project for next year? Got to be more. Is it going to be 4.8? If you look back at the last 150 years, 170 years, we don't see it. Could it be a light amount? Yes. Is it going to be more than 4.8? The probability is extremely high. But keep in mind that a lot of times when we've seen these very low amounts, the next year we've seen a lot higher amounts. Which brings us to the whole story or the whole subject of climate change. Interestingly enough, when everything started to close down because of the pandemic in March, a lot of cars off the roads. In the Northeast here, you can see tremendous amount of just clear roadways. It seems like it's a holiday morning at 9 a.m. every day on the highways. It may start to change over the next several days, but long story short, people aren't out. They're not using their cars. People aren't buying gasoline. Gasoline prices are dropping. All this, all figures. And the amount of pollution in the atmosphere associated with emissions from cars and from trucks and from just doing everyday business that we used to do for a longer period of time. Also, air travel. Air travel is down tremendously. There's a company that you can look online. It's called FlightAware. And they have the last 4 years of air travel. And it goes up during the summer, goes down in the winter, so on and so forth. Just normal. This year, of course, when we hit the pandemic, it all dropped out. Completely dropped out. You hardly see any airplanes in the sky at this point. If you do, you're seeing FedEx, Amazon, you're seeing UPS, U.S. Postal Service, and a little bit of Delta, a little bit of United. Not much more of that. Nobody's going back and forth to the different continents, so you're not seeing those bigger airplanes. So there's less pollutants in the atmosphere, and you're seeing that. Does that have something to do with the cooling that we have been experiencing in the month of April and in the month of May? It's really something that we should be looking into. It's something that's an interesting subject. So keeping that in mind, again, we've gone over the statistics that we've had for all of New York City since the 1868, 1869 winter right up to the present. What did we know and when did we know it? A lot of folks like to point to the Old Farmer's Almanac. So I have the Old Farmer's Almanac, which is the 2020 Almanac, and it has a weather forecast, and this is, of course, the Old Farmer's Almanac for 2020, and it has on it the weather forecast, some graphics, so to speak, for page 96, if you look at the latest issue. And on page 96, it says the winter of 2019-2020. Now, we're going to basically just deal with the Northeast because we're just talking about New York City, Philadelphia, and maybe a little of the Boston area, but they hardly had any snow also up there. So either way, what the forecast was for our winter was wet and wild. Wet and wild. I'm not sure what that means. They also said wintry. Wintry for the western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio region. I took a look at some of the information, how I have this New York City that goes from 1868, 1869 all the way to the present. Looked at it for Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh had low amounts too. So it wasn't wet and it wasn't wintry out there either. It was basically below normal snowfall. Below normal snowfall all across the Mid-Atlantic and northeastern states for this past winter. But what the Almanac says, and I'm going to have to read this to you because everybody loves the Almanac. They always get it right. Yeah. The Almanac cost me $7.99. So for $7.99, you think you're going to get an accurate weather prediction for a whole winter? I mean, really, honestly, stop and think about it. $8. Oh, here comes an accurate forecast for the whole winter. Well, basically, the winter forecast on these guys, and, I love it because there's great information in here. I love the Almanac. But, they say that, they sort of like mark their progress, mark their accuracy. I don't know. I don't have time to do that. But for the winter, it says temperatures will be below normal from the heartland, because this deals with the whole country, the heartland westward to the Pacific and in the desert southwest. Don't know if that's true. Maybe another day. Pacific southward and in Hawaii, but above normal elsewhere. Precipitation will be below normal in Florida and the Gulf Coast area, Texas, Oklahoma, and upper Midwest, and western desert southwest. It also says that Central California you're going to have a lower amounts of precipitation. Snowfall will be above normal from the southern Appalachians northward through western Pennsylvania. That did not happen. Remember I said Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh had below normal, well below normal precipitation, as did much of West Virginia, as did much of Ohio. That's my note. Going back to this here, it says most of Ohio and the heartland from northern Michigan westward to Puget Sound and the intermediate mountain regions and Alaska, they'll have below normal conditions. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. For the springtime, it says it will be warmer than normal in Alaska and the eastern two-thirds of the lower 48. So spring started on March 21st. Since that time, we've been below normal. Below normal in late March, below normal in April, below normal in May so far, except for a few warm days. The month probably will be 1 or 2 degrees below normal, but for our area it is going to be below. But they didn't know there's going to be a pandemic and not any pollution in the atmosphere, so maybe we have to give them a pass on that. But basically, for $7.99, you can get yourself an accurate picture of the weather coming up in the season. In my mind, I don't think so. But I got something else for you. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, we call them NOAA, did issue a winter outlook for 2019-2020 season. And their highlight of the whole deal was saying above average temps, average precipitation. And for the Northeast, which we're concerned with, there was a big old fat A right over New Jersey, Eastern PA, New York State, and much of New England, which means that temperatures are going to be above normal. What was it in December, January, February, and early March? Well above normal temperatures. Even November was well above normal temperatures. As far as precipitation was concerned, they forecasted basically near normal or equal chance of normal amounts of precipitation. It looks like, I think, our rainfall amounts or snowfall, actually not snowfall, but rainfall amounts were pretty close to normal because it was so warm. And when they take a look at 3-month outlook of temperature probability, they also had us in the above normal category. They did say that there might have been an equal chance for normal amounts of snowfall for New York City, the normal amount of snowfall in any given time. If you take a look at the averages, here comes out to be about 25, 27 inches of snow. It was well below that, so they didn't get that right. However, keep in mind that they did forecast above normal temperatures, and this pretty much was the trend that was happening in 2019. As we head into the winter of 2020. The temperature trends were well above normal, and that basically still panned out. So National Weather Service did a pretty good idea. They pretty good forecast for the upcoming season. Above normal temperatures, equal chance or normal precipitation. Really may not have hit the snow. I mean, who's going to forecast 4.8 inches of snow? I've been waiting for it forever. I've been saying one of these years is going to be really, really low. And the last few years we had mostly low amounts of snowfall, and then when we got to March, we had some extra storms, and that kept the amount for the whole season up. Well, this year didn't happen in March. Didn't happen in January, February. I mean, it happened a little bit in December and early January, but after that, the whole winter time laid down, and we had very low amounts of snowfall. So that's pretty much the reason for that. Other thing that we can take a look at, some of these private services also put out forecasts. What I'd really like to do is go back and see what the private weather company AccuWeather put out. AccuWeather is basically, I don't know why, but they really don't like the National Weather Service. They feel like the weather forecasting should be left to the private sector, and the Weather Service should just gather information and maybe do modeling data, which we'll get to in another podcast. But I don't necessarily believe that. The National Weather Service does a great job. These are professionals, and they work shift work, and they work 365, 24 hours a day, 365. They keep this thing going, and there's tons of work to do. We'll go into the normal day of the National Weather Service someday in a future podcast, but I really believe that they do a tremendous job. There are other organizations all across the world, in Germany, in Europe, in Britain, in Korea, in Japan, all doing weather modeling, weather forecasting. Some great information from them. Not sure what they forecasted for the Northeast. There was some talk about the El Nino being very strong, and El Nino winters have one type of characteristics. North Atlantic oscillations have other types of characteristics. All this different type of information that you can try to put together and come up with what the winter is going to be like. But suffice to say, you're always going to have in a decade a max and a min. And a lot of times those mins are less than 10 inches of snowfall for a season. That's what we had in 2019, 2020. Next year, probably going to have a high probability of it being more, probably better than 12 to 15 inches. But then again, I've seen some situations in the past where it completely switches around, and maybe because there's not going to be that many airplanes in the sky, cars on the roads, that many people out doing things, maybe there'll be less pollution, and with less pollution, you're going to have less rainfall, less cloud cover, less condensation nuclei, and you can have a colder than normal trend, and the possibility of snow is even greater. I don't know, but that's something that we'll be talking about in future podcasts. In the meantime, I am meteorologist Steve Pelletieri, and I am the weatherman. Thank you for tuning in to this episode on this past winter of 2019-2020. See you next time.